Just kind of worked out that way accidentally. But we've got Vincent Artman in to speak to you today. I've been trying to get Vincent in for Brownbag for quite a while now. It's been difficult, mainly because he's teaching. Vincent is a PhD candidate in geography.
Not a candidate. Yeah, I haven't done my comms. Just a
sorry. Working on his doctorate in geography. He has a BA and a master's, I believe, at the University of Oregon.
Yep.
And is teaching a course this semester with Austin Thielen, right?
Yes.
What's the name of the course?
Right now I'm teaching the geography of the former Soviet Union. Great class. I don't know when it will be offered next time because it was sort of one of these things where we kind of begged the department chair to let us do it, and they did, but they weren't happy about giving us the money to do it. So,
great experience.
Yeah, it's a great experience. It's been really fun.
So Vincent is going to be speaking on territorial aspects of passportization prior to the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Bart. As he said, this is the territorial aspects of passportization prior to the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. A bit of a mouthful. As he said, I got a master's degree in geography at the University of Oregon, and this paper came out of the work that I did for my master's thesis, and it's also currently under review in a somewhat different form in the Journal of Geopolitics. So hopefully I will have good news about that. And I'm a PhD student in geography here. My interest has sort of moved away a little bit from Georgia. I'm actually working on Islam in Kyrgyz cities at the moment, but I definitely have an abiding interest in this part of the world. So, as a geographer, my natural tendency is to look at space and territory. But if you read the literature on this war, space and territory tend to be, if not ignored, at least downplayed in most analyses. So, got this quote, I apologize, there's some long quotes in here. Recent attention, according to Kasimbakova, to the ways in which human populations have come to be constituted as objects of knowledge and intervention often leave territory contrastively underexplored. A territory, unlike population, is often treated as the finished product of governmental intervention, a backdrop on which projects of reform are conducted, but not itself an entity in formation. So following this, I hope to demonstrate that passportization was actually key in reconstructing the de facto states of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as quote-unquote legitimate spaces for Russian intervention, at least in Russia's eyes. Despite the fact that these de facto states were, and actually still are, de jure part of Georgia, passportization effectively subverted the norms of international law and discursively created what we could call Russian spaces within the legal borders of the Republic of Georgia. So, this is the Republic of Georgia. This is a crude map that I made, but I think it gets the point across. In the north, we see Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And in the south, we have a third autonomous region, Adjara. Now, these two, linguistically and culturally and ethnically, are not Georgian, although many Georgians and Georgian-speaking peoples live there. Abkhaz and Ossetians are not Georgian. People in Adjara, however, are ethnically Georgian. They simply practice Islam. Now, these were all included within the Republic of Georgia during the Soviet period. And throughout this time, there was always a little bit of squabbling for resources. And of course, the whole point of it was so that they had to go and look to Moscow to mediate the disputes, kind of a divide and rule sort of situation. This was particularly the case with Abkhazia. Out of all the three of them, it was by far the richest and sort of the most developed area. Not a whole lot in South Ossetia, not an awful lot in Adjara. And these squabbles over resources and autonomy got worse and worse and worse as the Soviet period progresses. And by the time that the Soviet Union collapses, of course, South Ossetia and Abkhazia are trying to fight for their independence. Adjara is ruled by a fellow named Aslan Abashidze, who is of a very kind of old lineage in Batumi. He basically rules Adjara up until after the Rose Revolution as a personal fiefdom. He's peacefully ousted by Saakashvili, and he goes back to Moscow. Adjara has been successfully reintegrated into the Georgian body politic. However, in the 1990s, both Abkhazia and South Ossetia try to fight for their independence, and Georgia tries to stop them. Horrible civil war occurs. At the same time, there's also a civil war happening in Georgia between the first president, Zviad Gamsakhourdia, and the former Soviet foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze. Russia throws its weight behind Shevardnadze because he's seen as being more pliable. He's seen as being less rabidly anti-Russian than Gamsakhourdia. And eventually, with Russian help, the wars in Abkhazia and South Ossetia wind down, but Georgia is not able to reintegrate them because Russia throws its weight behind the separatists. So what we get are what are known as frozen conflicts. We see these all over the former Soviet Union. In Transnistria, we saw some in Nagorno-Karabakh, certainly the ones in Georgia, and they're all characterized by a number of things. We have Russian-led CIS peacekeeping missions, and the CIS is a bit of a fig leaf. They're pretty much Russian peacekeeping missions. The peace process is dominated by Russia. Neither Abkhazia nor South Ossetia really take seriously anything that Georgia puts on the table, not only because some of the things that Georgia put on the table were a bit unrealistic, but also because they knew that Russia would back them up. They knew that, whatever Georgia put on the table, Russia basically would guarantee that they didn't have to take it. And we also see an instrumentalization of peacekeepers. The peacekeepers throughout most of these processes, particularly in Georgia, tend to be heavily invested on the sides of the separatists. So basically the peacekeepers were there to preserve the sort of semi-formal autonomy of the separatist states, even though Moscow was saying, hey, actually, we want to see a resolution to this. And as these peacekeepers were instrumentalized, their legitimacy in the eyes of the Georgians declined. So why did Russia do this? Well, regional hegemony. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were glad to sort of be rid of all these, what were in their eyes money sinks. But at the same time, geopolitics dictates that you don't just give up your influence. You don't give up territory. And so you want to reassert your dominance in the post-Soviet space. And you want to do this on the cheap. And it turns out that peacekeepers are a relatively inexpensive way of doing this. You also want to prevent all of this violence in Georgia from spilling over into the North Caucasus. You have Chechnya there, you have Kabardino-Balkaria, and all these other places. There was a very, very brief war fought in Ingushetia between North Ossetians and Ingush. And you want to prevent violence from Georgia spilling over into the North Caucasus. So you put peacekeepers there and clamp down on it. And geopolitically, you don't want Iran, you don't want Turkey, and you definitely don't want the United States getting too heavily invested in what's going on in Georgia. So you put someone in charge there, Shevardnadze, who is basically going to look toward Moscow and not NATO. However, the Rose Revolution, this is Shevardnadze, that's Saakashvili. The Rose Revolution in 2004 replaces Shevardnadze with the more Western-oriented Saakashvili. Saakashvili, as I said, really quickly reintegrates Adjara, which was ruled by this guy Abashidze, who again was a client of Moscow. And Russia freaks out and they're like, whoa, 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 what are you doing? That's our guy. And Putin actually says to Saakashvili after this happens, well, you may have gotten a favor from us in Adjara, but you're not going to get the same thing in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But Saakashvili doesn't take him very seriously, and because the reintegration of Adjara happens so easily, he goes, I can do the same thing in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And he starts calling for the peacekeeping missions and the Russian regular army, because there's a few of those still there too, to get out of Georgia, and he starts putting more and more things on the table in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which they reject. After this happens, after Adjara kind of falls, Russia accelerates passportization in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And by 2008, close to 90% of the populations there have become Russian citizens. Under the international law, however, they're still Georgian citizens. And Georgia does not allow dual citizenship. So we have sort of this break between the de jure, the law, and we have between that and the de facto situation, which is these people are accepting Russian citizenship. And in a lot of ways, handing out these passports and turning people into Russian citizens is much preferable to the peacekeepers, not only because the peacekeepers, again, were being viewed as illegitimate, but also because there's always a chance that if Georgia does something crazy or if the Abkhaz do something violent, that the Russian peacekeepers are going to get drawn into a shooting war, which is not what Russia wants to get itself involved in. So when the war in 2008 breaks out, after years of escalations between Russia and Georgia, and I don't want to get into all of those, there's a lot of them. Basically, people start, in the West particularly, start looking for what we can call proximate causes. The Rose Revolution. Why did Russia invade? Well, because the Rose Revolution eroded its influence, and it wanted to show Georgia that it still needed to take Russia seriously. Saakashvili was looking toward the EU, and it was looking toward NATO. And I have a good friend who spent some time teaching in Kazan, and whenever he talked about NATO to Russians in Kazan, he's from Croatia. He has an interesting language. He said, "Oh, they get the spiky hair." In other words, Russians really, really don't like NATO. The Russian government in particular feels that NATO is encircling them. And so this was, again, a way to tell Russia, or to tell Georgia, that no, you got to take us seriously. Around this time, the West also recognizes Kosovo as an independent country. And this was over the strenuous objections of the Russian government. And a lot of people have said, well, this is Putin basically, or, well, it was Medvedev by this point, sending a message to the West saying, well, if you can do that in Kosovo, we can do that in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And Georgia's your ally, see how you like it. And then, of course, the rationale that the Russians used was, oh, we have peacekeepers there, and we have citizens there, so, the Georgians marched in and they started shooting, and we had to protect them. The outcome of the war, also pretty cut and dried. The Georgian military is routed. They, have a couple of minor victories, but basically, by the end of the war, they are in full retreat toward Tbilisi and are talking about going up into the mountains to mount resistance. Saakashvili's legitimacy is not fatally, but severely undermined. And his first couple of years in office were definitely more star-studded, we could say, than his last few years have been. And Georgia is basically dismembered. This guy Kabachnik has done a study of maps that have been published in Georgia since the war, and in many of these maps, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are literally represented as limbs that have been hacked off of the body of Georgia by a Russian butcher or something like that. And it's really difficult now to see how Abkhazia and South Ossetia are going to ever willingly submit to Georgian rule again. But the weird thing is, of course, that they're still part of Georgia, right? They're not independent states. I think Venezuela, Russia, Tuvalu, Nauru, and maybe one other place recognize them as independent states, and nobody else does. So technically, they're still part of Georgia. So all this is fairly cut and dry. Why bother studying passports? Well, first off, passports are always mentioned in all of the literature. It's always said, oh, well, the Russians handed out passports to the people in these places, and then they marched in to protect them, and that's the end. So it's always mentioned in passing, but it's never problematized. Why do we study passports? Well, again, 90% of the population of these places by 2008 has accepted a passport, so it's pretty important. It was a pretty straightforward process, actually. Again, if you were in Abkhazia, and this is a fairly old report before passportization really even got started, back in 2002, this guy would say, well, you just send your passport up to Sochi. They put a new thing in there saying, now you're Russian, and they send it back. And the separatist governments, I would assume, in North Ossetia or in South Ossetia, it's sent it up to, Vladikavkaz or something like that. But the separatist government, in any case, facilitated this. They were happy to do it. There are some reports of coercion, people being forced to accept Russian citizenship, but they're basically unsubstantiated. I haven't seen any evidence to say that either it really happened or if it did, that it was widespread. In fact, most people were pretty happy to take them. Why? Well, you get a lot of benefits from taking a Russian passport. You get to travel more easily. The Russian state gives you better pensions than the Georgian state will. And maybe most importantly, you can go to Russia and get a job. And Georgian citizens at this time have very difficult opportunities in Russia because the Russian state has put a lot of sanctions on Georgia as part of this escalation before the war. And so it's very difficult for Georgian citizens to get work there. However, we have discursive effects too. It's not just this instrumental value that people are getting out of it. Ansi Passi has talked about signifying territoriality, some kind of symbol that you are in one territory and not another. And passports are pretty good documents of whether you are in or out of a particular nation, particularly when, if you're in Georgia, you're not allowed to have dual citizenship. So if you have the citizenship of another country in your hand, that's pretty solid proof that you are not a Georgian. And if you're an Abkhaz whose brother was killed during the war, the last thing that you want to be is Georgian. So passports signify their bearers' separateness politically, territorially, and even ideationally from the Georgian state. You also have this question of protection. Valery Arshba, at that time vice president of Abkhazia, is quoted as saying, "The president of the Russian Federation is the guarantor of the protection of the citizens of the Russian Federation, no matter where they live. Political protection implies military protection." This is in 2004, 4 years before the war. They knew that by taking these documents, that they were being drawn into Russia's sphere. And I think most importantly, again, it's a political statement, it's a physical document that attests that the person that's holding it is not part of Georgia. They are placing themselves in their minds, ideationally, in the territory of another state. And they have the documents to prove it. And this is important. So here's some documents. We have a Russian passport, a Georgian passport. These two are accepted, internationally. You can present these anywhere and they'll basically be accepted. These are passports from Yuzhnaya Ossetia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. The governments of these breakaway territories were handing out these passports even before or even at the same time that they were taking Russian passports. Nobody accepts these. They don't bring with them any kind of benefits whatsoever. You can't travel with them. They don't get you anything except one thing. They are documents that show we're not part of Georgia. Look, I have a passport and it says Yuzhnaya Ossetia. That's not that passport. It's very important. Just from a discursive standpoint, this is a document that says I am not part of Georgia. So if that's why people in the breakaway republics would take these, why bother for Russia? What's the point? You're giving pensions to a whole bunch of new people. Well, again, we have a number of different causes that people have identified, manufacturing a casus belli. So a reason to go to war. This is, we created citizens, they attacked our citizens, now we get to go fight. The kind of fig leaf of the legitimate war. Others have kind of identified this as kind of a sneaky form of imperialism, justifying territorial claims. This guy, Florian Munfried, wrote that it's a new form of imperialism adapted to the universal rules of the game as defined by the United Nations. I don't entirely buy into that one because I don't think that Russia is going out of its way to annex these places or to enlarge its territory. Maybe there's something to it, I don't particularly agree. And then we have this question of, basically making Russia a more direct player in what's happening in Georgia and reasserting its influence there, telling Saakashvili, listen, you might try to pull away, but good luck. Passportization may well have been motivated by any one of these or all of them, but what none of these actually do is tell us why passportization worked. Just handing a passport to someone does not magically give you the right to go and invade their country, no matter what the Russian constitution says about providing patronage and support to citizens abroad. This doesn't just magically occur. Something is working here. A couple of quotes. This is Ronald Asmus, who recently died, in his book on the Georgian War. Having handed out thousands of passports to individuals living on what it still considered Georgian territory, Moscow would now claim the right to defend its newly minted citizens. Important point. Up until the war, Moscow kept saying, we recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as being part of Georgia. And then they switched. Even though they were doing this all along, they kept saying, these are part of Georgia. And then this other guy, Littlefield, basically says the same thing. Russian politicians and diplomats expanded the boundaries of Russian citizenship to include the territory of a sovereign neighbor, and then acted in defense of the citizens this state had surreptitiously acquired. The citizens in need of protection were thus only Russian through prior infringements of Georgia's sovereignty. Well, again, just because they did this, just because they handed out these passports doesn't magically give them the right. Well, if I like to put it this way, the pen is to the sword as the passport is to the peacekeeper. In other words, the pen is mightier than the sword, and the passport in some ways is more effective in establishing Russia's control than the peacekeepers were. Because peacekeepers, by definition, are external to a conflict. So, you have Georgians here and Abkhaz here, and you stick Russians in between and say, we are the external mediating party who are keeping you apart. Russia is an external actor by definition, as long as they keep these peacekeepers here. But passports, they constitute Abkhazians and South Ossetians as part of the Russian political community. No longer is it Georgians and Abkhazians with Russia in the middle. You have Georgians and Russians, at least members of the Russian political community. And Mark Salter has identified the passport as the interface of the body and the body politics. So this is how the individual and the state in some ways interface with each other. So after passportization, an attack on Abkhazia and South Ossetia was no longer an attack by Georgia on South Ossetia, it was an attack by Georgia on Russia itself. So by taking these people, it was also taking territory. Samir Alatout has written, every construction of a population, whether a criminal, a patient, or a citizen, results in a territorial effect, a prison, a clinic, or a state. So by constituting Abkhazians and South Ossetians as Russians, what we could call Russian spaces were created inside the borders of Georgia. And we could call this a number of things: the discursive capture of territory, we could call it biocolonization. But the important thing is that it really opens up this gap between the de facto and the de jure. Because even though Abkhazians and South Ossetians are now directly under the patronage and control of the Russian state, they legally remain part of Georgia. So the production of Russian spaces in Abkhazia and South Ossetia was not accomplished by force. The war, in my opinion, solidified a situation that had already existed. And nor was it affected by physically moving people from Russia into Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Instead, it worked by colonizing bodies that were already there. It took people who, under international law, are Georgian citizens, and it flipped the switch and made them into Russian citizens. And basically, it substituted Russia's de facto sovereignty for Georgia's de jure competence over its individuals and territory. So the claim that I make is that passportization subverts the logic of the modern territorial system. Why do I say that? Well, according to Alec Murphy, in a forthcoming article, it's in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, sovereignty is kind of easily defined in three basic ways. I'm sure there's other ways we can define it, but I think these are fairly clear. Earth's surface should be divided into discrete territorial units. We call these states. States should reflect the pattern of political, cultural communities. We call these nations. And of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that these nations have to be, ethno-linguistic cultural units. They can be, civically defined nations as well. So Ruski versus Rossiyski. And importantly, areas under state control should be free from external influence. So, and Peter Taylor, in an old article, kind of backs up point number 2 here. He says, with the rise of the nation-state ideology, the community was indissolubly linked to the land. So you can't have, and going back again to Alatuk, you can't have the construction of a population, a political community, without a sort of discursive construction of territory as well. So paradoxically, it was this logic that kind of underpins the modern nation-state system that undermines the system itself. By including Abkhazians and South Ossetians in the Russian political community, passportization kind of becomes a novel vector for reshaping regional territorial discourses by exploiting this long-standing epistemic link between population and territory. We can also see Abkhazia and South Ossetia following Giorgio Agamben as exceptional spaces. So these are zones in which the normal application of law, or even human decency in some cases, is suspended. Agamben, in his study, Homo Sacer, identifies the camp, aka Auschwitz, the concentration camp, as sort of the original version of this, but some people have, Rhys Jones has said the border or border checkpoints are places where human life becomes no longer quite subject to the normal rules. And you can see here, Stuart Eldon has written that Agamben contends that the camp appears when the balance between the ordering of the state and its localization, that is, between sovereignty and territory, enters a period of permanent crisis, and the state decides to undertake the management of the biological life of the nation directly as its own task. That's actually a fairly good description of what happens in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Remember back to all of those lovely benefits that the Russian state was handing out to people who lived in the de facto states. It's taking the management of their life, giving them pensions, giving them work, protecting them from the Georgians as its own task, even though they are in the de jure territory of another state. We see this all over the place. Jenny Edkins and Eldon have both talked about what we can call humanitarian spaces of exception, the no-fly zone. Basically, you're looking at another state, you're seeing that they're doing something inhuman there, committing a genocide, committing territorial cleansing, whatever, and you say, sorry, but the normal rules of sovereignty, the rules that say we don't get to interfere in what's happening in your country, get thrown out the window, and somebody makes the decision to come in and establish that no-fly zone or that safe space or whatever. And interestingly, Russia kind of does the same thing. Vitaly Churkin, I think he was the ambassador to the United Nations for Russia in 2008, in a letter to the United Nations, invokes very specifically Russia's right of self-defense under Article 51. Well, how can you defend yourself in the territory of another state? Abkhazia and South Ossetia de jure are still part of Georgia. So when you are invoking your right of self-defense, what you're really saying is we're protecting people. We are defining these areas, the territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as places where Georgia doesn't get to do what it wants in its own territory. So, what are the lessons of passportization? Well, it's not merely instrumental. They didn't just hand out these things and people were like, well, that's sweet, now we get better pensions. It has powerful discursive effects as well. It redefines the territory upon which these people live as territory that in some way belongs to, another state. John Agnew has talked about the orthodox conception of sovereignty and how it's increasingly being challenged. Globalization of flows. So we have migration of people, we have migration of capital, pollution is spilling over borders. Borders and sovereignty in many cases are less important now than they used to be. We have, the war on terror, and we have black detention sites where we send people off in these extraordinary renditions. We can't torture them on American you know, territory. But if we send them to Bulgaria and just close our eyes and maybe they give us some information, we can do that. We have drone strikes in Pakistan and other places that we, you know, routinely violate Pakistan's, you know, sovereignty to blow up people in the territories. You know, some people like Derek Gregory have written that, you know, with the onset of the war on terror, the United States has in some ways defined the entire world as a space of exception. We can suspend the laws and blow people up wherever we want to, as long as we can say they're militants. So this conception of sovereignty, in which, you know, you don't get to mess around with what other states are doing inside their own borders, is sort of eroding a little bit. And international law, as it stands, is unable to adequately address phenomena such as passportization, which I would put in this list, which undermine the very logic of the state system itself. And yet, sovereignty is still really important. You know, despite the challenges that I pointed out on that last slide, the death of the nation state is probably not going to happen anytime soon. You know, Germany is not going to throw up its hands, especially now with what's going on in the EU, and go, you know what? Germany is no more. We're going to join the world community, however defined, and, you know, all this history of statehood is not what we want anymore. That's not going to happen. And importantly, statehood is still the goal. You know, Palestinians, Kurds, Abkhazians, and South Ossetians, all these people want to have states of their own. Statehood is still what they are aiming for. So that leads us kind of to the paradox of passportization. It employs the tools of the sovereign territorial system to undermine that very system. It widens the gulf between the de jure and the de facto by substituting the de facto rule of one state in the de jure territory of another state. And in many ways, it demonstrates the ubiquity of states of exception in current contemporary international relations. In fact, I would argue what's important about passportization is not that it was some kind of extraordinary thing that will never happen again, or that was really outside the bounds of what we understand. In fact, what was important about it was that the discourses it drew upon and the conditions that it produces are actually very commonplace. So, thank you very much. Got some references. I'd like to thank Alexander Murphy, who was, he read the master's thesis version of this. I'd like to thank Shannon O'Lear and Alex Diener, who read the paper version of this that's under review. I'd like to thank the Oregon Department of Geography and Kansas for funding me while writing the paper and doing this research. And then I'd like to thank FLAS, because they gave me some funding to go study Russian over the summer a couple of years ago. So I'll take any questions and comments. Thank you very much for coming.
History from failed attempts to become an